Tonight, we uncover the secret history of a world where gods were forgotten and demons took their place. A world where names, once sacred, were twisted, erased, and buried beneath layers of power and fear. In the grimoires of medieval Europe, hidden deep within the pages of conjurations and rituals, lie the remnants of pagan deities, their true identities disguised as demonic names. These books, though feared and forbidden, hold the key to an ancient struggle between faith, power, and memory. Names like Baal, Beelzebub, and Astaroth aren't just evil spirits. They're echoes of once revered gods, erased from history, but forever alive in the rituals of those who dared to remember. But how did these gods survive? How were they transformed into demons? And what do these names reveal about a past that the Church tried to bury? The truth is hidden in plain sight, waiting for those brave enough to read between the lines. So before we dive deeper into the shadowy world of medieval magic and its pagan secrets, make sure to like the video and subscribe. 1,000 years of ink and silence separate us from the moment when forbidden names first began to change. In medieval monasteries across Europe, scribes copied texts, not because they were curious, but because obedience demanded it. Yet, within these quiet rooms, surrounded by parchment, candle smoke, and prayer, something strange emerged. Lists of demons appeared in secret handbooks, grimoires passed hand to hand, never spoken aloud. Names like Baal, Astaroth, and Asmodeus were presented as enemies of God, spirits to be feared and controlled. But to a careful reader, these names carried echoes of something older. They sounded less like inventions and more like survivors. Long before Christianity reached northern and western Europe, people worshipped gods tied to storms, fertility, war, and the stars. When the Church expanded between the 4th and 9th centuries, it did not erase these figures overnight. Instead, many were recast. What had once been divine became dangerous. The scribe did not need to believe in magic to notice the pattern. He only needed memory. Medieval education relied heavily on copying earlier works, and fragments of classical and Near Eastern history still circulated. The name Baal was already known from the Bible as a rival lord. Astaroth echoed Ashtoreth, a goddess condemned in Hebrew scripture. Asmodeus appeared in Jewish texts centuries before Latin grimoires, tied to older Persian ideas of wrath. These were not random syllables. They were inherited names, reshaped to fit a new worldview. Grimoires were not fantasy books. Most surviving examples date from the 13th to the 15th centuries and were written in Latin by educated clerics. They mixed prayers, psalms, angel names, and ritual instructions. The irony is that the same church that condemned magic also produced the people capable of writing it. As scribes copied these texts, they saw that demons were organized, like officials, ranked and named with care. This reflected how medieval society understood power. A god reduced to a demon could still be useful, as long as it was controlled. The transformation was not accidental. Church writers used a method now called interpretatio Christiana, where older beliefs were redefined rather than denied. Pagan gods became fallen angels, illusions, or demons, to explain why people once worshipped them. This allowed Christianity to claim victory without admitting continuity. Yet continuity remained on the page. The scribe may not have dared to speak, but the ink preserved the truth. Demon names in the medieval grimoires function like fossils. They preserve layers of belief from Mesopotamia, Persia, Greece, and local European cults. Each time a name was copied, its older meaning was buried deeper, but never fully erased. What survives today is not proof of secret worship, but evidence of cultural memory. The whisper is not that demons were once gods, but that history rarely destroys. It disguises, renames, and waits. In that silence, the careful listener can still hear how belief changes shape, but never truly disappears, even when authority insists the past has been fully conquered by official doctrine alone. When people hear the word grimoire, they imagine fantasy books filled with monsters' spells and glowing symbols. But medieval grimoires were something very different. A true grimoire was a working manual written by educated people, often clergy who lived between the 12th and 15th centuries. These books were practical collections of instructions designed to interact with the unseen world using rules believed to govern creation itself. They blended Christian prayers, angelic names, astrology, mathematics, and ritual speech into one system. Grimoires were not about rebellion against God, but about accessing divine order through controlled means. Most surviving examples are written in Latin, because literacy belonged almost entirely to the church. A village peasant could not read a grimoire, even if he found one. The people who copied them were trained in scripture calendar calculation and astronomy. Astrology, in the medieval sense, was not superstition, but a respected science used to track seasons, feasts, and medical treatments. Grimoires relied heavily on planetary hours, lunar phases, and star positions because medieval thinkers believed heaven and earth were connected through harmony. This is why charts, tables, and timing instructions appear throughout these texts. Another misunderstanding is that grimoires were books of demons. In reality, many grimoires focus first on angels and divine names. Demons appear later, often framed as fallen spirits that could only be approached through God authority. The structure always placed divine power above all else. This made the books dangerous, but not openly heretical in the eyes of their writers. The danger came from misuse, not from intent. Many grimoires include long prayers borrowed directly from the Psalms or the Gospels. This was not disguise, but belief. The writers thought sacred language compelled obedience from lower spirits. The term magic itself did not mean fantasy. It meant specialized knowledge. In medieval lore, necromancy meant unauthorized ritual, not cartoon evil. A grimoire was closer to a laboratory notebook than a storybook. It recorded experiments, failures, corrections, and warnings. Some manuscripts even say, "Do not attempt this without proper fasting, confession, and purity." This shows how closely grimoires sat beside official religion. The Church condemned them publicly, yet preserved the skills needed to create them. This contradiction is key. Grimoires exist because the medieval world believed knowledge could shape reality. They were born from the same mindset that built cathedrals, calculated eclipses, and mapped the heavens. To understand grimoires correctly, we must stop treating them as fantasy relics and see them as serious documents from a time when faith, science, and ritual were not separate paths, but one continuous search for order, meaning, and control. This perspective explains why these books survived, hidden, copied, and feared for centuries. Because they belonged to the same intellectual tradition that produced calendars, medicine, architecture, and theology. And once we see that connection, the grimoires stop looking like forbidden fantasies and start revealing how medieval people understood power knowledge and the invisible structure of their world within society, religion, time, and authority itself during the ages. When Christianity began spreading across Europe, it did not enter an empty world. From the 4th century onward, missionaries encountered landscapes already filled with gods, spirits, ancestors, and sacred places. These beliefs were not abstract ideas, but part of daily life, tied to seasons, crops, war, and survival. The Church faced a serious problem. It could not simply erase these gods because people knew them by name and story. Instead, a strategy emerged that historians later called interpretatio Christiana. Rather than denying old gods existed, the Church redefined what they were. A god could become a demon, a spirit, an illusion, or a lie created to test faith. This approach allowed Christianity to explain pagan power without admitting legitimacy. It also allowed continuity while claiming victory. Sermons and church writings from the 5th to the 9th centuries show this clearly. Missionaries were instructed to destroy idols, but reuse temples. Sacred groves were cut down, but churches were built on the same sites. The message was clear. Power was not denied. It was claimed. Old gods were said to be fallen angels or deceptive spirits who once tricked humans into worship. This reframing solved a theological problem. If pagan gods had power, they could not be ignored. By calling them demons, the Church explained miracles, visions, and local traditions without threatening Christian authority. This process shaped medieval demonology. Names that once belonged to gods were preserved, but inverted. Astarte became Astaroth. Baal became a general name for demons. Pan became associated with the devil imagery of horns and hooves. These changes were not random. They followed language memory and fear. The Church used existing belief structures to teach new meanings. To a medieval listener, the idea that a demon once pretended to be a god made sense. It preserved experience while changing interpretation. This method also justified suppression. If old gods were demons, then worship became dangerous, not cultural. Laws against pagan practice in the 6th and 7th centuries reflect this shift. Worship was no longer ignorance, but rebellion against God. Yet, the names never vanished. They survived in sermons, penitential saints' lives, and later grimoires. Each time a preacher warned against an old deity, he reinforced its memory. By the High Middle Ages, these names were stripped of stories and reduced to labels of evil. But the origin remained embedded. This is why medieval demon lists feel ancient. They are ancient. They carry fragments of older religions reshaped to fit Christian theology. Interpretatio Christiana was not just a tactic of conversion. It was a system of control over memory. By defining what old gods were, the Church defined how the past could be understood. The result was a world where demons filled the gaps of history. They explained ruins, festivals, and customs that predated Christianity. The Church problem was never that old gods existed. It was that people remembered them. Turning gods into demons allowed the Church to manage that memory without erasing it entirely. And in doing so, it ensured that the old names would survive, hidden in fear rather than worship, waiting quietly in manuscripts, prayers, and grimoires long after their temples had turned to dust. The transformation from god to demon did not happen through fire alone, but through words repeated until they became truth. As Christianity spread its authority across Europe, the most powerful weapon was not the sword, but rhetoric. Sermons, penitentials, and polemical texts became tools for reshaping memory. These were not fringe writings. They were read aloud to communities copied by monks and used to define sin. Within them, divine names were carefully reworked. A god was no longer named as a rival power, but as a deceiver. A protector spirit became a tempter. A local deity became a threat to the soul. This shift allowed the Church to explain why people once worshipped these figures while warning them never to return. Penitentials from the early medieval period show this clearly. These books listed sins and their punishments, and often named specific gods or spirits that believers were forbidden to honor. The names appear not as myths, but as dangers. To speak them was to admit guilt. Sermons followed the same pattern. Preachers described demons who once masqueraded as gods to mislead the faithful. By repeating these claims weekly, the idea became normal. The rhetorical flip was subtle, but effective. Instead of arguing whether old gods existed, the Church assumed they did and explained them away. Polemical texts written against paganism reinforced this message. Church fathers like Augustine argued that pagan gods were demons who demanded worship to enslave humanity. This argument echoed through centuries. By the time of the High Middle Ages, it was no longer debated. It was assumed. The divine past was reframed as a history of deception. This rhetorical process preserved names while stripping them of honor. Baal was no longer a lord, but a demon prince. Ashtoreth became a symbol of lust and corruption. Pan became an image of chaos and temptation. These associations were not accidental. They matched the qualities the Church wished to condemn. Fertility became lust. Nature became wildness. Power outside the Church became rebellion. Through repetition, the meaning shifted completely. What mattered was not accuracy, but control. The audience did not need to know the original myths. They only needed to fear the names. Over time, these demonized names migrated into new contexts. They appeared in exorcism manuals and later in grimoires. By then, their transformation was complete. A name once spoken in prayer was now spoken in warning or command. The irony is that this process ensured survival. Names erased entirely are forgotten. Names turned into demons are remembered forever. The rhetorical flip from idol to infernal allowed the Church to dominate the past without erasing it. It created a usable enemy drawn from older belief systems. This enemy explained why the world before Christianity was flawed, and why obedience now mattered. The demon became proof of victory. But beneath the rhetoric, the original identity lingered. Language does not forget easily. Each demonic name carried a shadow of its former self. That shadow remains visible today in manuscripts, sermons, and ritual texts. The transformation was never complete. It was a mask placed over memory, and like all masks, it reveals as much as it hides about who shaped it, and why words were chosen carefully to rewrite belief itself. Every system needs a starting point, and medieval demonology did not invent one from nothing. Its foundation came directly from Scripture. Long before grimoires listed ranks of spirits, the Bible had already named enemies. These names became seeds planted deep in Christian memory. Baal-Belial and Beelzebub appear across biblical texts not as abstract evils, but as rivals to divine authority. By the time medieval scholars began organizing demon catalogues, these names were already charged with meaning, fear, and familiarity. Baal was never a single god, but a title meaning Lord used across the ancient Near East. Biblical writers used the name as a symbol of false worship. By condemning Baal, they condemned every local cult that claimed authority outside the God of Israel. This made Baal useful. It could represent many enemies at once. Over centuries, Baal shifted from a rival deity into a general demonic label. In medieval texts, Baal appears not as history, but as a commander of spirits. The transformation was complete, but the name remained powerful. Belial followed a similar path. In Hebrew, the word originally meant worthlessness or lawlessness. In early scripture, it described people rather than beings. Sons of Belial were rebels, troublemakers, enemies of order. Over time, the word hardened into a name. By the Second Temple period, Belial had become a personified force of evil. In later Christian thought, Belial was no longer an idea, but a demon prince. This shift mattered because it showed how language could evolve into entity. Medieval writers inherited Belial as a ready-made symbol of chaos, opposition, and corruption. Beelzebub completed the trio. Originating from Baal-zebub, a local deity associated with Ekron, the name appears in the Gospels as a title for the ruler of demons. The phrase Lord of Flies may have begun as mockery, but it became doctrine. When Jesus was accused of casting out demons by Beelzebub, the name was sealed into Christian imagination. From that moment, Beelzebub was no longer a local god, but the enemy behind all enemies. Medieval demonologists did not question this origin. They expanded it. These three names became templates. They showed how a rival could be turned into a demon without losing authority. Grimoires borrowed this structure. They took older names and framed them as servants' officers or kings of hell. The Bible provided legitimacy. If Scripture already named enemies, then cataloguing them seemed logical. The seed list also offered hierarchy. Baal, Belial, and Beelzebub were not random. They represented lordship, rebellion, and command. Later demon lists followed the same pattern, assigning ranks, legions, and duties. This mirrored both scripture and medieval administration. The result was a demonology that felt ancient and ordered. But it was built from selective memory. These biblical names did not erase older meanings, they absorbed them. Each time a medieval scribe wrote Baal or Beelzebub, he unknowingly echoed centuries of belief before Christianity. The seed list grew because it was rooted in fear and familiarity. Scripture gave demonology its first vocabulary. Grimoires simply expanded the grammar. And once those names were fixed in sacred text, they could never fully disappear. They became permanent fixtures of the Christian imagination, shaping how evil was named, organized, and remembered for centuries to come, even when their original identities had long been buried beneath layers of doctrine authority and controlled interpretation of the past. The name Baal did not begin as a single god, and that is precisely why it survived so long. In ancient Semitic languages, Baal simply meant lord or master. It was a title, not a personal name. Communities across the Levant used it to refer to local deities tied to weather, fertility, and protection. There was no single Baal, but many Baals, each connected to a place, a people, and a function. When biblical writers condemned Baal worship, they were not targeting one figure, but an entire system of local authority that rivaled centralized faith. This made Baal the perfect enemy. It could stand for everything outside the approved order. As Christianity inherited Jewish scripture, this flexibility became even more useful. Baal transformed from a title into a symbol of false power. Medieval theologians no longer needed to know which Baal was which. They merged them all. The many became one. In demonology, Baal appears as a singular infernal king, often ruling legions of spirits. This version absorbed centuries of memory from different cults and regions. Storm gods, harvest gods, and guardian gods collapsed into one demonic identity. This process erased distinctions while preserving fear. Grimoires from the late medieval period list Baal, with specific traits such as commanding invisibility knowledge or influence. These traits echo earlier divine roles. A god of storms becomes a demon of power. A god of fertility becomes a demon of temptation. The transformation was not random. It followed cultural memory even when writers no longer recognized the source. The Church never officially promoted Baal demonology, but it tolerated it within controlled texts. By allowing Baal to exist as a demon, the Church explained why older beliefs felt powerful. It also warned against returning to them. Baal became a cautionary tale rather than a living god. The name continued to spread because it was already familiar. Sermons, penitentials, and later grimoires repeated it. Each repetition stripped away context and added menace. By the High Middle Ages, Baal no longer belonged to any specific tradition. He belonged to demonology. Yet traces remained. The plural nature of Baal explains why the name could absorb so much. When medieval scribes wrote Baal, they unknowingly referenced multiple histories at once. This made Baal more than a demon. It made him a container for erased religions. The many Baals survived as one because consolidation is easier than deletion. A single enemy is easier to control than many forgotten gods. This pattern would repeat with other names, but Baal was the prototype. His transformation shows how language reshapes belief. Titles become names. Names become demons. Demons become tools of doctrine. And beneath it all, the memory of local gods remains encoded in a word that once meant lord and later meant enemy. Baal did not disappear because he was too useful. He could represent everything Christianity rejected without naming each tradition individually. In that sense, Baal became the shadow of all pagan authority. A single label covering countless lost gods whose worship ended, but whose names endured hidden inside a demon catalogue that still circulates today, quietly carrying fragments of a world that once understood power very differently than medieval theology ever allowed. The name Beelzebub carries one of the clearest examples of how an older deity was reshaped into a symbol of ultimate corruption. Its origin lies in Baal-zebub, a local god worshipped in the Philistine city of Ekron, mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. The name likely meant Lord of the Dwelling or Lord of the Height, but biblical authors altered it to mean Lord of Flies, turning reverence into ridicule. This was not an accident of translation, but a deliberate rhetorical move. By mocking the god, the text stripped it of dignity while preserving its identity. Over time, this altered name took on a life of its own. In the Gospels, Beelzebub appears again no longer as a local deity, but as the ruler of demons. When Jesus is accused of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, the name becomes permanently linked to infernal authority. From that point forward, Beelzebub was no longer a footnote of regional worship, but a central figure in Christian demonology. Medieval theologians inherited this image fully formed. They did not question whether Beelzebub had once been worshipped. They treated him as proof that pagan gods were demons all along. This made Beelzebub extremely useful. His name could be invoked in accusations of heresy, possession, and witchcraft. To associate someone with Beelzebub was to place them beyond debate. Sermons used his name to embody corruption, decay, and pride. The image of flies feeding on rot reinforced ideas of moral and spiritual filth. In medieval thought, flies were symbols of disease and death, making the association emotionally powerful. Grimoires later expanded Beelzebub's role even further. He appears as a high-ranking demon, often rivaling Satan himself in authority. Some texts assign him command over legions, others portray him as a prince of hell. These descriptions vary, but the status remains high. This elevation shows how a once mocked local god became one of the most feared names in Christian imagination. Beelzebub transformation also reveals how demonology absorbed and exaggerated earlier identities. The original Baal-zebub likely served as a healing or protective deity. By turning him into the Lord of Decay, Christian rhetoric inverted his purpose. Healing became corruption. Protection became domination. This inversion allowed the Church to explain why people once trusted such a figure. They were deceived. The name survived because it was anchored in Scripture. Once canonized, it couldn't be erased. Medieval writers expanded it safely, knowing it rested on biblical authority. Accusations invoking Beelzebub carried weight because they echoed gospel language. This is why the name appears so often in trials, confessions, and sermons. It functioned as shorthand for ultimate opposition to God. Yet, beneath the layers of fear and doctrine, the older memory persists. Beelzebub is not a newly invented demon, but a recycled god reshaped through centuries of language control. His journey from local lord to cosmic enemy shows how names migrate through belief systems, changing meaning while retaining power. Beelzebub endured, not because he was feared, but because he was useful as a symbol of everything that had to be rejected, controlled, and condemned, and in that role his name became immortal within the very tradition that claimed to destroy the gods of the past. The name Astaroth is one of the clearest examples of how a goddess could survive in memory only through inversion. Its origin traces back to Astarte or Ashtoreth, worshipped across the ancient Near East from the 2nd millennium BCE onward. She was a prominent figure in Canaanite and Phoenician religion associated with fertility, love, and war. Her cult was widespread, documented in inscriptions, temple remains, and biblical texts. When Israelite and later Christian authors encountered her worship, they framed her as false and dangerous. The Hebrew Bible condemns Ashtoreth repeatedly, linking her to idolatry, immorality, and rebellion against God. These condemnations formed the basis for later demonological reinterpretation. By the 13th century, in grimoires and demon catalogues, the name had morphed into Astaroth, a malevolent spirit commanding legions of demons. The inversion from goddess to demon is striking. Attributes once seen as protective or beneficial were recast as deceitful, lustful, or destructive. Medieval writers did not merely rename her. They redefined her entire function within the spiritual cosmos. Astaroth became a cautionary figure, a warning against returning to the allure of older beliefs. The survival of her name reflects the tension between memory and authority. While her original worship was suppressed, the sound and structure of the name persisted because it had already been recorded in scripture and oral tradition. This allowed demonologists to use it with authority. Texts from the 15th century describe Astaroth with detailed hierarchies, powers, and punishments. He is frequently paired with Beelzebub and Belial, showing the consolidation of demonized pagan figures into a coherent, infernal system. The shift from female to male also reveals cultural attitudes. Goddesses in earlier societies held independent authority, whereas medieval demonology often recast these figures in subordinate, corrupted, or oppositional roles. This gender transformation reflects broader theological and social biases. Astaroth's evolution also illustrates the process of interpretatio Christiana, where older deities are reframed to fit Christian cosmology. rituals, prayers, and grimoires describe invocations not to honor, but to bind, control, or protect against Astaroth. The language of fear replaces the language of reverence. Yet beneath the layers of inversion, traces of her original role remain. Fertility, knowledge, and influence are recast as temptation, manipulation, or seduction. Scholars studying grimoires can detect these echoes, understanding that each demonic name is layered with pre-Christian memory. The survival of Astaroth demonstrates that the past is never completely erased. Memory is transformed, controlled, and reframed to serve authority, but fragments persist. In grimoires, rituals, and sermons, Astaroth serves as a bridge between the ancient goddess and the medieval demon, showing how power, belief, and culture intertwine to preserve what must be feared rather than forgotten. The goddess behind the mask remains, silent yet persistent, reminding us that names carry history even when their meaning has been inverted, hidden, or condemned. The demon known as Asmodeus shows how names and ideas about evil travelled across cultures long before medieval grimoires existed. Its earliest appearances are found in Jewish texts, such as the Book of Tobit, from around the 2nd century BCE, where Asmodeus is described as a destructive spirit interfering in human relationships. The name itself is thought to derive from the Avestan word Aishma, a demon of wrath in ancient Iranian Zoroastrian tradition. Aishma was feared as a force of violence, anger, and chaos, opposing the orderly cosmos created by Ahura Mazda. As Jewish communities interacted with Persian culture during the Babylonian exile and later periods, elements of Iranian demonology entered Hebrew thought. By the time the figure of Asmodeus appeared in Jewish law, the character already carried layers of meaning, combining divine punishment, personal destruction, and cosmic opposition. Medieval Christian writers inherited this figure when Jewish texts became accessible through translations into Latin, particularly during the 12th and 13th centuries. In grimoires, Asmodeus was described as a powerful demon associated with lust, vengeance, and obstruction, showing how a spirit of wrath could be transformed into an organized infernal officer with defined roles. Unlike names imported from scripture, such as Baal or Beelzebub, Asmodeus represents a case of cross-cultural adaptation. The core traits remained intact, but the context changed. Jewish interpreters emphasized morality and divine justice, while Christian demonologists framed him within hierarchical systems of hell, linking him to other infernal powers and codifying his rank and duties. The process demonstrates that demonology was not created in isolation, but borrowed, adapted, and repurposed from earlier religious and cultural frameworks. Asmodeus's presence in grimoires also reflects the medieval fascination with cataloguing spirits according to function, influence, and personality. A demon of wrath could serve as both a warning and a tool. Ritual instructions in manuscripts included prayers, seals, and invocations to bind Asmodeus or compel obedience, revealing that practical considerations shaped how these spirits were conceptualized. Furthermore, the name illustrates how fear and respect could travel across linguistic and geographic boundaries. Aishma became Asmodeus through translation, reinterpretation, and theological framing. The continuity of character shows that even as names change, the underlying idea of disruptive power persists. By the High Middle Ages, Asmodeus had become a recognizable figure in Christian demonology, appearing in lists alongside Beelzebub, Belial, and Astaroth. scholars copying and compiling grimoires rarely questioned origins. Instead, they used the name as authority, legitimizing rituals and moral instruction. This trajectory highlights how medieval Europe inherited a complex network of spiritual concepts. Names crossed cultures, absorbed new meanings, and were repurposed to fit local theology and ritual needs. Asmodeus is an example of cultural transmission, showing how ideas about wrath and chaos could move from Zoroastrian Persia to Jewish texts and finally into Christian occult manuals, proving that the development of demonology was a mosaic of borrowed, adapted, and reinterpreted traditions spanning centuries and continents. King Solomon occupies a central place in the tradition of medieval grimoires because his reputation bridged the sacred and the magical. According to the Hebrew Bible, Solomon ruled Israel in the 10th century BCE and was famed for wisdom, wealth, and the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. Beyond governance, legend emphasized his ability to understand animals, control spirits, and wield supernatural authority through divine wisdom. By the 12th century, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions had elaborated these stories into a complex legend, portraying Solomon as a master of ritual and hidden knowledge. This reputation made him the ideal figure to lend legitimacy to grimoires, many of which contained instructions considered dangerous or heretical if attributed to ordinary mortals. The so-called Key of Solomon, surviving in multiple Latin and Hebrew manuscripts from the 14th and 15th centuries, explicitly claims Solomonic authorship. These texts include detailed instructions for invoking angels, commanding spirits, constructing talismans, and performing purification rituals. By attaching Solomon's name, scribes framed the knowledge as divinely sanctioned, not the invention of a heretic or magician. The Solomonic brand created trust, especially in a world where possessing ritual knowledge without authority could result in suspicion, excommunication, or execution. Authority through association was vital. Solomon was already a figure approved in Scripture and respected across cultural boundaries. Jewish scholars emphasized his wisdom in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Christian writers highlighted his godly insight, and Islamic texts depicted him as a prophet endowed with supernatural understanding. Each tradition contributed to the aura of legitimacy that allowed dangerous material to circulate safely under the mantle of Solomonic control. This branding also allowed grimoires to navigate complex theological constraints. Rituals that involved angels, planetary, hours, or even commanding demons were justified, because they were not acts of human rebellion, but practices modeled on the biblical king who had divine approval. Manuscripts include prayers and incantations, beginning with invocations of God through Solomon, reminding the practitioner that power flowed from divine authority filtered through the king. The appeal of the Solomonic brand persisted, because it addressed fear and ambition simultaneously. People desired knowledge of the unseen, but feared consequences. By framing rituals as the work of Solomon, texts suggested that obedience, precision, and proper ritual could protect against spiritual danger. Modern historians recognize this as both clever branding and theological strategy. Solomon's legendary mastery served as a safeguard and a seal of authenticity. Without such authority, many grimoires might never have been copied or preserved. The combination of fame, scriptural backing, and supernatural control made Solomon an enduring symbol. His name provided a bridge between human curiosity and divine law, legitimizing the transmission of occult knowledge through centuries and ensuring that practitioners could explore ritual practices with the reassurance of biblical precedent, moral sanction, and historical authority, all encoded in the enduring brand of Solomon. The Key of Solomon, or Clavicula Salomonis, is one of the most influential grimoires in the history of ritual magic because it functions as a bridge between liturgy and practical occult practice. Manuscripts of the text first appear in Latin in the late medieval period, around the 14th and 15th centuries, although its content draws on much older Jewish and Near Eastern traditions. These texts present a combination of prayers, invocations, angelic names, and ritual instructions designed to control spiritual forces. What makes the Key of Solomon unique is its claim of Solomonic authorship, providing divine and historical authority for its practices. The text often begins with blessings, instructions for purification, and detailed descriptions of sacred tools, emphasizing that the practitioner must be morally and spiritually prepared. This connection to liturgy is deliberate. The prayers, many drawn from the Psalms or adapted biblical language, root the ritual in Orthodox faith, while allowing the practitioner to engage with angelic or infernal forces under controlled conditions. Manuscripts show a remarkable attention to detail. They describe the exact materials for talismans, the hours when rituals should be performed, and the specific names to be invoked. These instructions reflect the broader medieval belief in cosmic harmony, where planetary hours, lunar phases, and divine names held real influence over the physical and spiritual world. The Key of Solomon was copied and transmitted across Europe, appearing in Italy, France, and Germany, often in elegantly decorated codices intended for educated readers. The text was not simply a magical manual, but a guide for disciplined spiritual practice. It reflects a world where the sacred and the practical were deeply intertwined. Scholars have noted that the rituals, while magical in appearance, mirror clerical methods of prayer, purification, and liturgical order, suggesting that authors sought legitimacy by aligning their instructions with church-approved forms. The Key also helped codify the structure of later grimoires. Its categorization of angels, spirits, and demons into ranks, its detailed procedural rules, and its emphasis on moral readiness, provided a model that would influence European occult traditions for centuries. Its influence extended into the Renaissance when humanist interest in classical texts and Jewish mysticism merged with ongoing magical practice. Copies circulated among scholars, clerics, and occult practitioners, blurring the lines between religious devotion and practical magic. The text's survival demonstrates the medieval desire to reconcile faith with curiosity about unseen forces. By situating ritual practice within a framework of prayer and moral discipline, the Key of Solomon legitimized knowledge that might otherwise have been condemned. It also preserved older traditions, incorporating angelology, demonology, and planetary theory in a form accessible to those literate in Latin and trained in clerical methods. The Clavicula Salomonis stands as a historical artifact, showing how ritual magic was framed as a controlled extension of liturgy, providing a roadmap for spiritual authority that combined inherited Jewish wisdom, medieval cosmology, and the legendary mastery of Solomon into one enduring tradition. Sefer Raziel, or the Book of Raziel, is a pivotal text in Jewish mystical tradition that influenced the development of medieval grimoires through its Latin translations and adaptations. The original Hebrew text, compiled around the 13th century, claims to reveal secrets given by the angel Raziel, to Adam after the expulsion from Eden. It contains lists of angels, mystical names, astrological instructions, and practical advice on understanding the cosmos. Its purpose is not purely magical, but educative, aiming to teach humans how to comprehend divine order and interact with spiritual forces safely. When the text was translated into Latin during the late medieval period, it became part of the broader European occult landscape. Latin versions, circulating from the 14th century onward, often adapted the material to suit Christian audiences while preserving the framework of angelic hierarchy. These versions cloaked potentially controversial practices under the guise of angelic devotion. The rituals and instructions resemble conjuration, but are framed as authorized communication with heavenly beings. Names, symbols, and timing instructions are presented as divinely sanctioned rather than human innovation. This strategy allowed scribes and practitioners to study and employ these techniques without openly defying church authority. The Latin Raziel manuscripts influenced the production of ritual handbooks and grimoires, serving as a bridge between Jewish mysticism and European magical practice. Angels were central, and their names provided both legitimacy and structure for operations that would otherwise appear dangerous or heretical. Detailed instructions describe how to invoke angels for protection, insight, or guidance, often with precise formulas, planetary hours, and sacred inscriptions. The language used in these texts is carefully ritualized, combining Latin prayers with transliterated Hebrew or mystical terms to create an aura of authority and sanctity. This approach mirrors the broader trend in medieval magic of embedding potentially subversive practices within orthodox frameworks. By presenting these actions as angelic rather than demonic, practitioners could justify their work as morally and spiritually correct. Scholars note that Sefer Raziel's transmission demonstrates the flexibility of mystical knowledge. While rooted in Jewish cosmology, its principles were adapted to European contexts, influencing texts such as the Heptameron, attributed to Pseudo Pietro da Bano, and later grimoires that emphasized angelic intervention. The preservation of angelic names, the use of coded instructions, and the careful attention to ritual order all reflect a desire to maintain control and authority while exploring the boundaries of spiritual practice. The Latin afterlives of Raziel show how texts could navigate cultural, religious, and linguistic boundaries, providing a safe channel for knowledge that might otherwise be considered illicit. Angelic language thus functions as both protection and disguise. It legitimizes the exploration of hidden forces, permits the documentation of ritual, and ensures that the practitioner remains within the sanctioned boundaries of faith. Through Sefer Raziel and its adaptations, the medieval world preserved a complex system where the divine, the hidden, and the practical intersect, allowing ritual magic to flourish under the appearance of sanctioned devotion. Picatrix is one of the most important conduits through which Arabic magical and astrological knowledge entered medieval Europe. Originally composed in Arabic under the title Gayat al-Hakam, sometime in the 11th century, it was translated into Latin in 13th century Iberia, during a period when Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars collaborated in cities like Toledo and Valencia. The Latin translation made this vast compilation of talismanic, astrological, and celestial magic accessible to European readers who were literate in Latin, but often unfamiliar with Arabic. Picatrix is organized as a systematic guide to the influence of the stars and planets on earthly affairs and the construction of talismans designed to harness that power. The text describes planetary hours, zodiacal correspondences, and celestial hierarchies, providing practitioners with precise instructions for aligning their rituals with the movement of the heavens. Unlike popular fantasy notions of magic, Picatrix relies on careful observation and the belief that the cosmos is interconnected, a principle rooted in both Neoplatonic and Islamic cosmology. The work also preserves centuries of Arabic astrological theory, including detailed tables for planetary motion and the effects of constellations, demonstrating that ritual magic was inseparable from astronomical knowledge. Its influence in Europe was significant because it bridged cultural and intellectual gaps. Scholars and magicians could integrate practical astrology into their own frameworks without violating the broader religious norms, as the book emphasized harmony with divine order rather than rebellion. Picatrix also includes extensive discussion of the materials, colors, shapes, and timing necessary for creating talismans, emphasizing that each object and act must correspond to celestial forces to achieve the desired effect. This combination of science and ritual made the text highly influential for later European grimoires and manuals of practical magic. The translation of Picatrix illustrates how knowledge was transmitted across linguistic, religious, and cultural boundaries. While the original Arabic drew on earlier Hellenistic, Persian, and Indian sources, the Latin version became a reference point for scholars in Italy, Spain, and France, influencing the development of Western magical thought. Its prescriptions for drawing symbols, invoking planetary powers, and constructing ritual instruments provided a blueprint for later texts claiming Solomonic or angelic authority. Picatrix demonstrates that medieval magic was not chaotic or imaginative in the way modern fiction portrays it. It was a disciplined system grounded in observation, theory, and precise procedure. The text also reflects the blending of cosmology, religion, and ritual, showing that European practitioners of the 13th and 14th centuries inherited a complex, transnational body of knowledge that had been circulating in the Mediterranean for centuries. Through Picatrix, the astral pipeline from the Arabic world carried detailed knowledge of planetary influence, astrological timing, and talismanic construction into Europe, shaping both scholarly and practical approaches to ritual magic, and leaving a lasting imprint on the formation of Western occult traditions. Many medieval rituals that modern observers would call necromancy relied heavily on tools and language borrowed from the Church. Manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries show that practitioners often used Latin prayers, the names of saints, consecrated objects, and formulas similar to those found in liturgy, to achieve ends that were strictly forbidden by ecclesiastical authorities. This borrowing was not accidental. The Church had created a system in which sacred language and objects carried real spiritual authority. To harness that authority for ritual purposes, scribes and magicians adapted what was available. Texts instructing the summoning of spirits or commanding the dead often begin with purification, confession, and the invocation of God, reflecting the assumption that divine permission was required for any interaction with the supernatural. Holy water, candles blessed by a priest, and consecrated circles appear repeatedly in these rites. The language is precise, drawing from psalms, canonical prayers, and sometimes exorcisms. These practices blurred the line between sanctioned devotion and illicit manipulation. Necromantic manuscripts, such as the Grimorium Verum and various Latin ritual collections show detailed instructions for communicating with the dead, obtaining knowledge, or influencing events, all under the guise of piety. The logic was simple. If words and objects have inherent spiritual power, then using them carefully could achieve outcomes that ordinary prayer could not. Clerical clothing and ritual mimicry also play a role. Practitioners were often literate individuals, sometimes minor clerics, who could read and write Latin. Their knowledge of church structure, feast days, and canonical hours allowed them to schedule rituals according to spiritual and cosmic timing. This expertise gave rituals the appearance of legitimacy. Furthermore, the inclusion of sacred names and consecrated tools provided a protective framework. The practitioner was instructed to proceed with moral preparation and reverence, emphasizing that failure or impiety could result in spiritual harm or demonic backlash. This mirrors the broader medieval understanding that magic was effective only when it aligned with the natural and divine order. The distinction between permitted prayer and forbidden necromancy was therefore subtle and dependent on intent and context. Church authorities were aware of these practices and often condemned them vigorously, yet the overlap between clerical knowledge and magical ritual made enforcement complex. Manuscripts circulated in secrecy, copied by those trained in liturgical language who understood the risks. The result is a corpus of ritual texts in which the tools of faith are used to engage with the forbidden. Necromancy in clerical clothing demonstrates that medieval magic was not a purely secular or rebellious pursuit. It relied on the very framework of the Church, repurposing holy words, objects, and rites to achieve ends that were officially prescribed. The surviving manuscripts reveal a sophisticated understanding of the spiritual world, a recognition of the authority embedded in sacred forms, and the creative ways that practitioners navigated the boundaries between obedience, curiosity, and power. The Sworn Book of Honorius, or Liber Juratus Honori, is a prime example of a medieval grimoire, where the highest aspirations of ritual practice coexist with methods that were viewed as suspect or even dangerous. Believed to have been composed in the 13th century, the text presents itself as a manual for communicating with angels, gaining knowledge, and exercising spiritual authority. Its authority is rooted in its claim to be the work of Honorius of Thebes, a figure reputed to have received divine instruction directly. The text is notable for its insistence on moral preparation, emphasizing confession, fasting, and purity before any ritual. This insistence aligns it with the ideals of clerical devotion and the broader liturgical tradition. At the same time, the techniques prescribed are extraordinary. The Liber Juratus Honori contains instructions for invoking specific angels, using consecrated circles, writing divine names with exact forms, and performing complex prayers timed with celestial movements. These procedures require extreme precision and demonstrate a belief in the structured interconnection between heaven and earth. The text carefully blends canonical prayers with ritual instructions that resemble conjuration, illustrating how clerical language and sacred authority were adapted for practical ends. Scholars note that the Sworn Book of Honorius occupies a middle ground. On one hand, it presents itself as a tool for spiritual enlightenment and divine communication. On the other, it includes instructions that, if misused, could be interpreted as necromancy or sorcery. This duality reflects the medieval tension between authorized ritual and forbidden magic. Latin prayers angelic invocations, and ceremonial objects are all intended to channel divine power safely. Yet, the very act of attempting to command spiritual forces placed the practitioner at risk of ecclesiastical censure. The text also codifies a hierarchical approach to angelic communication. Angels are named, ranked, and assigned specific functions. This structure mirrors both the celestial order described in Jewish mystical texts like Sefer Raziel and the Latin liturgical frameworks of the Church. By providing this organization, the Liber Iuratus Honori legitimizes the rituals while creating boundaries intended to protect the practitioner. Its influence extended into later European grimoires, which adopted its combination of sacred authority, ritual precision, and complex invocation. Manuscripts survive in multiple copies, often heavily annotated by scribes who clarified procedures or added instructions for safe practice. The Sworn Book of Honorius demonstrates that medieval ritual manuals were not purely imaginative, but serious guides reflecting the period's cosmology, theology, and ethical concerns. They show that practical magic was inseparable from moral preparation, scriptural literacy, and ritual discipline. The text occupies a unique space where devotion, scholarly knowledge, and mystical aspiration converge, illustrating both the potential and the peril of accessing powers that were officially beyond human authority. By examining the Liber Iuratus Honori, we see how medieval magicians navigated the thin line between sanctioned spiritual practice and the forbidden, combining the highest liturgical ideals with techniques that required extreme care, obedience, and respect for the powers invoked. The Munich Manual of Demonic Magic, a 15th century manuscript, offers one of the clearest glimpses into how ritual magic was practically executed in late medieval Europe. Unlike idealized or heavily theological grimoires, this text functions as a working sorcerer's notebook, detailing the exact words, gestures, and materials needed for conjurations. Its Latin text includes invocations of demons, lists of their names, and step-by-step instructions for commanding them to perform tasks ranging from revealing hidden knowledge to influencing people or events. The manual emphasizes precision. Each ritual specifies the time of day, the placement of candles, the preparation of circles, and the pronunciation of sacred and demonic names. Planetary hours and lunar phases are noted, reflecting the contemporary belief in cosmic correspondences. This careful documentation demonstrates that magic was approached as a disciplined practice, not merely superstition or fantasy. The Munich Manual also illustrates how ritual combined the sacred and the forbidden. Prayers, invocations of God, and the use of Latin scripture appear alongside the summoning of infernal beings. This combination reflects the broader medieval strategy of cloaking potentially dangerous acts in religious legitimacy, ensuring that the practitioner maintained moral and spiritual protection. Scholars studying the text note that the manual doesn't abstractly theorize about magic. Instead, it shows how spells and conjurations were physically written and performed. The instructions include how to prepare talismans, the specific words to be inscribed, and the gestures required to enforce authority over spirits. Marginal notes suggest corrections or observations from previous practitioners, implying that the manuscript was actively used and adapted over time. This practical orientation contrasts with earlier Solomonic or angelic grimoires that focus on theory, hierarchy, or moral preparation. The Munich Manual emphasizes efficacy and control. It also demonstrates the influence of cultural transmission. Many of its rituals and demons show echoes of Jewish Arabic, and earlier Christian traditions. Names of spirits resemble those found in the Key of Solomon, or Sefer Raziel, while the operational focus recalls Arabic talismanic magic preserved in texts such as Picatrix. The manuscript thus serves as a bridge between intellectual knowledge and hands-on practice, showing how magical theory was implemented in daily ritual work. Its survival in the Bavarian State Library allows modern researchers to see the meticulous care taken by practitioners and the structured approach to commanding supernatural forces. The Munich Manual exemplifies a period in which magic was both technical and moral. The practitioner needed skill, precision, and knowledge of sacred language to succeed. It confirms that in 15th century Europe, ritual magic was a serious craft, transmitted through manuscripts, refined over generations, and executed with a combination of fear, respect, and confidence in the efficacy of written and spoken words. This text shows that magic was not abstract or literary, but deeply practical, a hands-on engagement with the unseen world conducted through carefully codified techniques that could be studied, practiced, and mastered. Medieval grimoires frequently organize spirits into detailed hierarchies with ranks, titles, legions, and assigned duties, reflecting the bureaucratic mindset of the time. Texts such as the Key of Solomon, the Munich Manual of Demonic Magic, and the Lesser Key of Solomon systematically categorize spirits into kings, princes, dukes, and marquises, each commanding specific numbers of subordinate demons. This structure mirrors contemporary social and political organization in Europe, where kings delegated authority to nobles and officials, and clerical administration managed large networks of monasteries, parishes, and secular estates. By applying the same logic to spiritual beings, grimoires made the invisible world comprehensible and navigable for practitioners. Lists of names, often accompanied by seals, sigils, or descriptions of powers, provided a sense of control and predictability. If each spirit had a defined role, the practitioner could theoretically summon, command, and dismiss it safely. These hierarchies also served a pedagogical function. For scribes, students, or aspiring magicians, understanding the chain of command was crucial to performing rituals correctly. Manuals often emphasize that bypassing ranks, summoning without proper preparation, or disrespecting authority could lead to failure or danger. The organizational style reflects a broader medieval tendency to impose order on both earthly and spiritual domains. In Europe, from the 12th to the 15th centuries, administration, record-keeping, and ceremony were highly codified, whether in royal chancelleries, episcopal offices, or monastic scriptoria. Demon hierarchies in grimoires can therefore be seen as an extension of familiar administrative principles applied to the spiritual sphere. The precise enumeration of legions and the assignment of specialized functions, such as knowledge, wealth, seduction, or protection, illustrate the integration of practical concerns with moral or cosmic symbolism. Each spirit's office aligns with a perceived aspect of human experience or natural order, reinforcing the notion that the universe, including the infernal realm, is structured and lawful. Scholars note that this approach also pervaded a form of intellectual legitimacy. By presenting demonic activity in the same language used for secular governance, ritualists framed their work as orderly and disciplined, rather than chaotic or anarchic. It allowed them to claim authority over spirits in a way analogous to political or clerical office. Furthermore, assigning duties and documenting them in grimoires created a reference system. Future practitioners could consult manuals to confirm a spirit's rank, attributes, and obligations. This reduced ambiguity and enhanced reproducibility, essential qualities for practical ritual work. The bureaucratic imagination of medieval Europe thus shaped the very form of demonology. Hierarchies, offices, and legions were not invented arbitrarily, but were the product of cultural expectations about order, authority, and the delegation of power. By mirroring human administrative structures, grimoires translated the unknown spiritual world into a system intelligible to their readers, making it possible to engage with, study, and control forces that were otherwise invisible and potentially dangerous. The lists of names, ranks, and duties reveal that magic was not only spiritual, but organizational, a reflection of the medieval mind-seeking clarity, predictability, and command over both the seen and unseen realms. The office of spirits concept in medieval grimoires illustrates how practical organization shaped the development of later demon catalogues. Texts from the 14th and 15th centuries, including the Munich Manual of Demonic Magic and the Solomonic manuscripts, systematically describe spirits according to roles, ranks, and powers, often borrowing terminology familiar from clerical and royal administration. Each spirit is assigned specific duties, spheres of influence, and hierarchical relations, creating a structured system that could be referenced, memorized, and utilized safely. This methodical approach directly informed the creation of the Gothic family tree, the standardized lists of demons that appear in the Ars Goetia section of the 17th century Lesser Key of Solomon. By compiling information from earlier offices of spirits, authors produced comprehensive catalogues where kings, princes, dukes, and marquises of hell were enumerated alongside the number of legions they commanded, their powers, and the conditions under which they could be summoned. The continuity between offices and catalogues reflects both practical necessity and cultural influence. Medieval readers were accustomed to bureaucratic systems, whether in courtly, clerical, or municipal settings, and applying the same logic to spirits allowed practitioners to navigate the infernal world with clarity and authority. The office of spirits also demonstrates how knowledge was transmitted and standardized. Manuscripts often circulated in multiple copies, with scribes annotating, cross-referencing, and merging information from diverse sources. This process led to more uniform representations of demons, consolidating disparate traditions into a single framework. The Gothic family tree is the culmination of this effort, organizing spirits into a coherent system that could be studied and applied consistently. Historical analysis shows that these offices were more than theoretical. Practitioners relied on them to ensure ritual efficacy and safety. By adhering to the hierarchy, respecting ranks, and invoking spirits according to prescribed protocols, ritualists believed they minimized risk and maximized results. The office of spirits also served as a pedagogical tool. By categorizing spirits with specific functions and relationships, manuscripts trained new practitioners in the language, symbols, and procedural discipline necessary for magical operations. This standardization allowed complex knowledge to be transmitted across generations and regions, reinforcing both continuity and authority. Scholars note that the influence of clerical administration, liturgical order, and social hierarchy is evident throughout. Just as medieval institutions depended on chains of command, record-keeping, and codified duties, so too did these early magical systems structure the unseen world. The Gothic family tree represents the apex of this intellectual strategy, producing a reference work that organizes spiritual knowledge into a recognizable, logical, and usable form. By tracing its roots to the office of spirits, we can see how meticulous documentation, hierarchical thinking, and the desire for control transformed diverse folkloric and mystical traditions into the standardized demonological frameworks that dominated European grimoires from the 15th century onward. This process ensured that spirits were no longer nameless or chaotic, but classified, accountable, and integrated into a systematic magical worldview. Pagan names often survive in medieval texts, disguised through a variety of mechanisms that made older deities acceptable within Christian frameworks. One common method is phonetic drift, where the sounds of a name gradually change over centuries as languages evolve. For example, Canaanite or Phoenician deity names could be altered in pronunciation as they were recorded in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or vernacular texts. These shifts made the original identity less obvious, while preserving enough of the name to maintain a historical trace. Latinization was another key process. As scribes copied texts into Latin, they adapted names to fit grammatical and phonetic patterns of the language. A goddess like Astarte could become Astaroth, preserving the consonantal structure but altering gender and meaning. Copying errors also played a role. Manuscripts were handwritten, often under difficult conditions, leading to variations, misspellings, and misreadings that accumulated over time. These accidental changes could obscure a deity's origin, while simultaneously embedding it in demonological or magical texts. Deliberate relabeling was perhaps the most powerful mechanism. Church authorities and theologians actively reinterpreted pagan gods as demons, spirits, or false idols, using familiar names in a context that warned against their worship. Baal, once a title meaning lord applied to multiple local gods, became a demonic figure in Latin and European grimoires. Beelzebub, originally Baal-zebub, transformed through linguistic change and polemical framing into a principal demon of the infernal hierarchy. These strategies served multiple purposes. They allowed scribes and scholars to preserve ancient knowledge without endorsing heresy, created continuity with the past, and provided a framework for teaching moral lessons about idolatry and sin. The mechanisms also facilitated transmission across cultures. As texts moved from Hebrew to Greek to Latin and into regional vernaculars, names adapted to each linguistic environment, creating layers of meaning that could be traced historically. Scholars studying these texts can often reconstruct the original deities by examining consonantal patterns, contextual associations, and comparative mythology. Understanding these processes is essential for recognizing how pagan religions persisted beneath the surface of medieval demonology. The names themselves act as historical fossils, offering evidence of worship practices, cultural exchanges, and linguistic transformations. Through phonetic drift, Latinization, copying errors, and deliberate relabeling, older gods were hidden in plain sight, reappearing as the demons, spirits, and angels catalogued in grimoires. This survival is not accidental, but a reflection of both continuity and control, demonstrating how medieval authors negotiated the tension between memory, authority, and doctrinal orthodoxy. By tracing these mechanisms, historians can uncover the layers of reinterpretation that preserved fragments of pre-Christian religion, revealing a complex interplay of fear, adaptation, and cultural preservation that underlies the familiar demon names of the European magical tradition. Demon names in medieval grimoires function as memory fossils, preserving layers of cultural, religious, and linguistic history within a single word. Each name is not merely a label for a spirit, but a compressed record of centuries of interaction between local cults, biblical polemics, and imported magical or mystical traditions. For instance, the name Beelzebub reflects a Canaanite origin as Baal-zebub, meaning Lord of Flies, which was later demonized in Jewish and Christian texts to signify false or malevolent worship. In this transformation, the name carries evidence of ancient local cult practices, while also encoding biblical reinterpretation and polemical intent. Similarly, Astaroth preserves the memory of Astarte, or Ashtoreth, a goddess revered in Phoenician and Canaanite societies, whose worship was reframed through the lens of Christian demonology. The phonetic and semantic shifts reveal both linguistic evolution and deliberate theological shaping. These names also record the transmission of knowledge across cultures. Many spirits in European grimoires, including Asmodeus, trace back to Persian, Jewish, and Arabic sources, incorporating traits and associations from multiple religious traditions. Each adaptation leaves traces within the name, reflecting the layers of history, translation, and reinterpretation that preceded its appearance in a Latin text. Importantly, the names serve as mnemonic devices for practitioners. The compressed form allows magicians to recall complex cosmologies, hierarchies, and ritual associations efficiently, linking a single word to an array of powers, ranks, and symbolic meanings. At the same time, these names act as cultural signposts, revealing which traditions were considered threatening, heretical, or valuable enough to preserve under controlled conditions. The concept of a memory fossil underscores that medieval demonology is not arbitrary. It is a repository of cultural memory, where local religious practices, scriptural debates, and imported mystical lore converge. The layering is cumulative. Each time a name is copied, adapted, or invoked in a ritual, it accumulates further significance and authority. Scholars analyzing these names can reconstruct elements of lost cults, understand the influence of biblical interpretation, and trace the movement of magical concepts across time and space. The mnemonic and evidential roles of demon names highlight the sophistication of medieval ritual and scholarly practice. Far from being mere superstition, these names encode historical information, social anxieties, and intercultural exchanges. By examining them, historians gain insight into how European societies remembered, transformed, and controlled the spiritual and cultural past. Every demon name is a microcosm, a fossil of memory that records the entanglement of religion, magic, and language. It illustrates how knowledge deemed dangerous or heretical could survive in compressed form, allowing practitioners and scholars to engage with a rich tapestry of inherited traditions while navigating the boundaries imposed by orthodoxy. In this way, the demon name becomes a window into the medieval mind, a preserved fragment of collective memory that continues to inform our understanding of history, culture, and belief. The circulation of medieval grimoires was driven by a diverse range of individuals, each motivated by curiosity, professional interest, or the pursuit of power despite bans, fear, and social scandal. Clerics were among the primary copiers of these texts, leveraging their literacy, access to manuscripts, and training in Latin to reproduce material that could not be widely published. They often balanced their religious duties with personal study, viewing grimoires as repositories of secret knowledge that could enhance spiritual insight or provide practical advantage in matters of protection, healing, or ritual authority. Students, particularly those at universities in Paris, Bologna, or Oxford during the 14th and 15th centuries also engaged with grimoires. Their educational emphasized classical texts, theology, and natural philosophy, and some sought occult knowledge to complement their formal studies. Access to books was limited, so copying a manuscript was both a way to learn and a means to preserve valuable information that might otherwise vanish. Physicians and alchemists likewise found grimoires useful. Many medieval medical theories relied on astrology, humoral balance, and the manipulation of unseen forces, making ritual texts practical guides. Latin translations of Arabic and Jewish sources, such as Picatrix or Sefer Raziel, provided information on celestial influence, talismans, and angelic hierarchies, which could be applied to both healing and protective rites. Nobles and patrons occasionally commissioned copies to consolidate personal libraries or to gain influence through the possession of esoteric knowledge. Such individuals recognized the prestige attached to rare manuscripts and the social advantage of controlling access to powerful texts. Copying was a risky enterprise. The Church condemned unauthorized magical practice, and the Inquisition or local ecclesiastical authorities could punish those found engaging with forbidden texts. Yet this danger may have enhanced the allure of grimoires, framing them as secret treasures containing knowledge that bridged divine authority and human ingenuity. Marginal notes, annotations, and corrections in surviving manuscripts show that scribes engage critically with their sources, sometimes adding their own interpretations or practical adjustments. The act of copying thus became both preservation and commentary, ensuring that the texts evolved while retaining their original purpose. The networks of manuscript transmission reveal a web of trust and secrecy. Copies often circulated among like-minded practitioners, exchanged between students, clerics, physicians, and noble patrons, in discrete settings such as private libraries, monastic scriptoriums, or personal studies. This circulation demonstrates that despite official condemnation, the demand for occult knowledge persisted across social strata and geographic regions. Historical analysis confirms that the survival of many grimoires depended on these human networks of copying and preservation. Without the efforts of clerics, students, and practitioners willing to risk ecclesiastical censure, much of this material might have been lost. Their motivations ranged from scholarly curiosity to practical necessity, personal power, and spiritual ambition. The act of copying was therefore a deliberate intervention in the preservation of knowledge, reflecting both the dangers and the enduring appeal of forbidden wisdom in medieval Europe. Medieval grimoires were closely tied to the anxieties of church authorities, inquisitors, and pastoral officials who sought to control access to forbidden knowledge. From the 13th century onward, inquisitorial records reveal a consistent concern with texts that described conjurations, angelic or demonic hierarchies, and ritual practices that could be interpreted as heretical. Rumors of dangerous books circulated quickly, and manuscripts were often pursued not only for their content, but for the social and moral threat they represented. Confiscation was a common tool. Ecclesiastical authorities instructed local clergy to identify, collect, and destroy books deemed dangerous or heretical, a practice formalized in part through the Index Librorum Prohibitorum in later centuries. The act of confiscation served multiple purposes. It prevented the spread of unauthorized practices, reinforced clerical authority, and created a visible demonstration of church control. Inquisitors relied on confession and denunciation to locate hidden texts. Those suspected of copying or reading grimoires were questioned about their sources, motivations, and the identities of others involved in circulation. Records from Spain, Italy, and France indicate that even minor clerics or students could face censure or imprisonment if found in possession of such manuscripts. Archives maintained by ecclesiastical institutions, monasteries, and university libraries functioned as both repositories and control points. Books that survived were often catalogued, restricted, or sequestered, ensuring that access was limited to trusted individuals or scholarly authorities. This archival control created a complex trail of preservation and suppression. Grimoires that might have been lost were preserved because officials maintained records or moved copies to secure locations. Yet, their circulation was tightly monitored and censored. Historians studying these archives note that the pursuit of forbidden books was not uniform. Local enforcement varied according to political, social, and religious conditions. In some regions, inquisitorial oversight was rigorous, and manuscripts were rapidly confiscated and destroyed. In others, books circulated under the radar, copied and exchanged among scholars, students, and private collectors despite the risk of scandal. The archival and inquisitorial practices reveal a tension between curiosity, knowledge, preservation, and control. While authorities aimed to suppress potentially dangerous practices, their methods inadvertently documented the existence and transmission of these texts. Marginalia, notes, and catalogue entries in surviving manuscripts provide evidence of these processes, showing which books were sought, questioned, or restricted. This network of condemnation, confession, and archiving reflects broader mechanisms of power in medieval Europe, where control of information was inseparable from spiritual and social authority. Grimoires occupy the intersection of curiosity and fear, illustrating how forbidden knowledge was pursued, suppressed, and preserved simultaneously. By tracing the archive trail, we see that the medieval approach to dangerous books combined rumor, investigation, and institutional authority, creating a framework that shaped the survival, secrecy, and influence of ritual texts throughout the centuries. The anxiety surrounding grimoires ensured they were both feared and carefully maintained, leaving a complex legacy for modern historians. Reading medieval grimoires requires careful separation of historical sources from later interpretations, occult mashups, and modern legends. The surviving manuscripts, including the Key of Solomon, the Munich Manual of Demonic Magic, and the Liber Juratus Honori, provide direct evidence of ritual practices, angelic hierarchies, and demonological frameworks as they were understood in the 14th and 15th centuries. These texts reflect the intellectual, religious, and social contexts of their time, including the influence of Latin liturgy, Jewish mystical traditions, Arabic astrology, and local folk practices. By focusing on these primary sources, we can identify the techniques, intentions, and organizational principles of ritual magic, without imposing modern fictional or sensationalized narratives. Many popular accounts of grimoires, however, mix historical fact with literary embellishment, conflating medieval procedures with cinematic or literary images of witches, demons, and supernatural power. This can obscure the disciplined and often moralized nature of the original texts, which emphasize preparation, purity, and adherence to hierarchical structures. Polemical sources, such as sermons, penitentials, and inquisitorial records, also shape our understanding, but must be read critically. These writings often exaggerate or misrepresent the practices described in grimoires to warn against heresy, idolatry, or forbidden knowledge. While they provide valuable evidence of perception and fear surrounding ritual magic, they do not always accurately depict the methods or intentions of practitioners. Separating manuscript content from polemical framing allows historians to reconstruct the operational logic of ritual texts, including their use of consecrated objects, angelic and demonic names, astrological timing, and precise verbal formulas. Contextual study also highlights the cultural and intellectual exchanges that influenced grimoires, such as the transmission of Arabic talismanic knowledge through the Latin Picatrix, the incorporation of Jewish mystical traditions via Sefer Raziel, and the adaptation of classical or pagan deities into demonological hierarchies. Understanding these interactions provides clarity about the historical development of magical texts and prevents the projection of later myths onto medieval sources. Modern occult practices often claim continuity with medieval grimoires, yet they frequently reinterpret or repurpose material in ways that diverge from the original cultural and religious frameworks. Recognizing this distinction is essential to reading grimoires historically, as it allows us to appreciate their structure, purpose, and intellectual rigor without conflating them with contemporary myth or fantasy. By examining manuscripts, their contexts, and their reception in a critical, historically grounded manner, we gain insight into how knowledge, fear, and authority intersected in the medieval world. Reading grimoires without the myth reveals a rich landscape of spiritual experimentation, ritual precision, and cultural transmission that has often been overshadowed by sensationalized accounts. It allows us to see the texts as tools, records, and expressions of medieval thought, rather than as portals to imagined powers, emphasizing the importance of historical method in understanding their true significance. Closing a medieval grimoire is not merely the end of a reading session, but an encounter with the layers of history encoded within its pages. Each demon name, ritual instruction, and hierarchical list reflects centuries of religious memory, social negotiation, and cultural adaptation. By tracing names like Baal, Beelzebub, Astaroth, and Asmodeus through manuscripts from the 13th to the 15th centuries, scholars see the survival of older gods transformed by Christianity into spiritual adversaries. These names act as markers, preserving traces of local cults, imported mystical traditions, and biblical polemics, showing that the memory of pre-Christian Europe did not vanish, but persisted in altered form. Manuscripts such as the Key of Solomon, the Munich Manual of Demonic Magic, and the Liber Iuratus Honori record these adaptations with precision, documenting both the cosmology of spirits and the practical rituals used to engage them. The act of copying and preserving grimoires by clerics, students, physicians, and nobles ensured that this knowledge survived despite bans, inquisitorial scrutiny, and the fear of scandal. Confiscation, confession, and archival control created an intricate paper trail, allowing historians to reconstruct the transmission and transformation of these texts. By examining the context of production, circulation, and polemical response, it becomes clear that grimoires are more than magical manuals. They are maps of cultural memory, encoding how Europe remembered, reshaped, and sometimes suppressed its spiritual past. The structure of angelic and demonic hierarchies mirrors medieval administration and societal organization, providing a systematized approach that made the unseen world intelligible to practitioners. Names survive through phonetic drift, Latinization, copying errors and deliberate relabeling, allowing older deities to persist in forms that were doctrinally acceptable, while simultaneously serving as evidence of historical continuity. In this light, each grimoire can be read as a repository of memory, where ancient cults, imported magical knowledge, and biblical interpretation converge into single words, symbols, and ritual formulas. The last page of the book reminds us that the study of these texts is not a pursuit of superstition, but a journey through layered history. The demons, rather than being purely imaginary, act as witnesses to the complex interplay of authority, religion, and cultural preservation in medieval Europe. They demonstrate how knowledge deemed dangerous or heretical could survive in coded form, shaping both ritual practice and the perception of spiritual power. In closing the manuscript by candlelight, the scholar recognizes that these names refuse to die because they carry memory, continuity, and the resilience of human belief across centuries. The grimoires reveal that Europe's spiritual landscape was never fully erased. Instead, it was transformed, catalogued, and mediated through ritual, scholarship, and ecclesiastical authority. By studying the surviving pages, we gain insight into the persistence of older gods, the negotiation of forbidden knowledge, and the ways cultural memory endures even under the pressure of orthodoxy. The last page is not the end of history, but an invitation to recognize that memory, encoded in names and rituals, continues to illuminate the past, showing how the shadows of ancient belief persist in the structured world of medieval grimoires.